I found out my daughter's college fund was short by $22,000 4 days before her 16th birthday. Sitting at my kitchen table in Sacramento, California, staring at a 529 plan statement that made absolutely no sense compared to the contribution history I'd been tracking in my own spreadsheet for the past 11 years. My name is Junia Pemberley, 41 years old, and I want to explain something about how that account had been structured, because I think it matters enormously to understanding exactly what happened and exactly why my mother's explanation, once she finally offered one, didn't hold together the way she clearly hoped it would. When my daughter Sable was born, I opened a 529 college savings account in my own name as the account owner, with my mother, Eleanor Whitcomb, added as an authorized signer specifically to handle administrative tasks during a difficult period when I was working overseas for 8 months on a military spouse relocation, a temporary convenience that had simply never been formally removed once I returned. Largely because my mother had always handled the account's paperwork competently, and I'd never had any reason to think closely about the arrangement again. I want to be honest about how disorienting it felt, staring at that statement, understanding that a fund I had personally contributed to every single month for 11 years, currently needing to show roughly $94,000 based on my own careful tracking, actually held just under $72,000. I called my mother that evening, calmly, genuinely believing at that point that some kind of administrative error must have occurred. "Oh," she said, after a long pause I found immediately unsettling. "I think I might have accidentally used some of that account when I was helping Paige with her kitchen remodel last year. I have several accounts I manage, Junia, and I think I simply confused which one I was pulling from. I'm sure it was just a paperwork mix-up." I want to describe the specific, sinking feeling that explanation generated, because something about it didn't sit right with me even in that first conversation, well before I'd actually verified anything. My sister Paige's kitchen remodel had been a fairly significant undertaking the previous year, one I remembered clearly because Paige had mentioned, at a family dinner, that our mother was helping out with some of the costs, a detail that had seemed unremarkable at the time, long before I had any reason to wonder exactly which funds that help had actually come from. I requested the full transaction history for Sable's 529 account the following morning, a process that took considerably longer than I expected given my mother's status as an authorized signer rather than the primary account owner, eventually requiring me to formally assert my own ownership, rights directly with the plan administrator to access complete records. What those records showed, once I finally had them in front of me, reframed my mother's accidental mix-up explanation entirely. There had been 6 separate withdrawals from Sable's account over the previous 14 months, each one processed individually, each one requiring my mother to specifically select that particular account from a menu of several she managed, ranging in amount from $2,800 to just over $6,000, totaling the full $22,000 shortfall. I want to be honest about something important here, because I think it matters considerably to understanding how deliberate this pattern actually was. My mother managed 3 separate accounts at that time: Sable's 529 plan, her own personal savings account, and a dedicated home improvement fund she had established specifically for Paige, intended to help Paige and her husband cover renovation costs on their house. Confusing Sable's clearly labeled college fund with a separate account explicitly designated for Paige's kitchen remodel wasn't the kind of mistake that could plausibly happen once, let alone 6 separate times across more than a year. I confronted my mother directly, 3 days later, sitting across from her at her own kitchen table with the full transaction history printed and laid out between us. "Withdrawals, Mom," I said. 6 separate times you specifically selected Sable's account instead of Paige's home improvement fund. That's not an accident. I need you to actually tell me what happened." My mother's composure, which had remained carefully intact through our initial phone conversation, finally cracked, revealing something considerably more uncomfortable than a simple administrative mix-up. "Paige's renovation budget ran over," she admitted. Considerably over, and she was embarrassed to ask for more help after I'd already given her $12,000 from the home improvement fund I'd set aside. I told myself I'd replace what I borrowed from Sable's account before you ever needed to know, once Paige and her husband's finances stabilized enough for them to pay me back. I know how that sounds now, Junia. I'm not proud of it. I want to be honest about the complicated mixture of anger and genuine hurt I felt hearing that explanation, understanding that my mother had made a calculated decision, repeated 6 separate times over more than a year, to prioritize my sister's kitchen renovation over my daughter's college savings, while actively constructing a story about accidental confusion, specifically designed to avoid having that decision examined honestly. I want to explain something important about 529 college savings plans that became directly relevant to how this situation ultimately resolved, because I think it matters to understanding the specific leverage I actually had. As the account's legal owner, rather than simply an authorized signer, I retained full legal authority over the account regardless of who had been handling day-to-day paperwork, which meant my mother's withdrawals, however she'd process them administratively, represented unauthorized use of funds I had never actually relinquished ownership or control over. I met with a financial attorney the following week, a careful, direct woman named Odalise Ferreira, who confirmed that I had clear legal standing to demand full repayment, potentially including the tax penalties the account would eventually incur if the shortfall wasn't corrected before Sable needed to begin drawing on it for actual tuition expenses. Since 529 funds not used for qualified education expenses trigger a 10% federal penalty on the earnings portion of any non-qualified withdrawal, a penalty that would apply directly to the $22,000 my mother had diverted, regardless of her original intention, to eventually replace it. I brought this information to my mother, not out of any desire to escalate the situation into a formal legal dispute within our family, but because I needed her to understand the full, concrete consequences of what she'd done, beyond the emotional betrayal I'd already expressed. If this money isn't replaced before Sable needs it for actual tuition, I told her, the account itself could face tax penalties on top of the missing principal. This isn't just about the $22,000 anymore, Mom. It's about protecting Sable from a financial consequence she had absolutely nothing to do with creating. I want to describe what happened over the following 6 months, because I think it matters considerably more than the initial confrontation. My mother, working with Paige, developed a formal repayment plan, with Paige contributing directly to the repayment given her own awareness of where the additional renovation funding had actually come from, an awareness she admitted to me directly during a difficult conversation of our own, that she'd suspected but never directly confirmed at the time, choosing not to ask too many questions about money that had conveniently solved her own financial problem. I should have asked more directly where that extra money was coming from, Paige told me. I think some part of me didn't want to know because I needed the help too badly to risk Mom saying no. Full $22,000, plus an additional amount my mother voluntarily contributed to cover potential tax implications, was fully restored to Sable's account within 8 months, funded through a combination of my mother liquidating a portion of her own retirement savings and Paige and her husband refinancing a portion of their mortgage, specifically to formalize repayment of what had, in practice, become an informal loan neither of them had ever properly disclosed or documented. I want to be honest about where my relationship with my mother and sister stands now, roughly 2 years after I first discovered that shortfall. It's considerably more careful than it was before, built on a foundation of formal documentation and clearly established boundaries that hadn't previously existed in our family's informal approach to money and mutual assistance. I removed my mother as an authorized signer on every account I manage, a decision I made without any dramatic confrontation, simply as a quiet, permanent correction to an arrangement that had clearly outlived whatever convenience it had once provided. Sable, now 17 and actively researching colleges, doesn't know the full details of what happened, though she's aware, in general terms, that her college fund experienced some complications that required careful attention to resolve. I've made a deliberate choice not to burden her with the specifics, understanding that her actual college fund, fully restored and continuing to grow exactly as it should, matters considerably more to her future than any detailed accounting of the family conflict required to protect it. I think often about the specific phrase my mother used in that first phone conversation, accidentally, and how much careful, deliberate repetition it actually took to create what she initially tried to present as a single, understandable mix-up. 6 separate withdrawals, over 14 months, each one requiring her to specifically choose my daughter's college fund over funds actually designated for the purpose she was using them for. I don't think my mother is a fundamentally cruel person. I think she made a series of increasingly difficult decisions under pressure from Paige's financial embarrassment, decisions that compounded over time into something considerably larger and harder to reverse than any single choice might have originally seemed. But I also think protecting Sable's actual future required me to name that pattern honestly, rather than accepting the considerably smaller, more comfortable story my mother initially offered instead.